Hi everyone, today I'm going to be showing you how to render this little scene here in Vray for SketchUp. Vray is a rendering engine that you can download for many different softwares actually. You can download it for Rhino and Maya for example. You can get a free trial that lasts for about a month, so if you are wanting to give it a go, you like the look of what you see in this video, then I would recommend getting all your digital models to a finished standard, get them so that you're happy with everything and you don't want to make any more changes. Then download the trial and you should have plenty of time to render your models if you are rendering them outside of the university. Okay, so Vray is an extension. So when you open up SketchUp after downloading it, you'll see there's an extensions tab. I'm going to click on that, go down to Vray and open up the asset editor, which is basically the big Vray control panel. Sometimes it can take a little while to load up as well. There we go. Okay, so I'll talk you through what we've got going on here. The very first thing that opens up is our materials panel. And these materials are all in our SketchUp model. So although most of what I've got here doesn't have a texture, the hat and the bottle and the figure you actually get at the start, all those textures appear here. So I can actually apply any texture that's on Chris right at the start onto any other part of my model. At the top we've got our directory, so this materials panel is this little icon here on the very left. If we click on the light bulb, we've got all our lights. By default, you've only got sunlight, but I'll show you how to add in individual lights a little later on. And then probably the most important panel is the settings, where it controls our export. So any animation or render, you can render a 360 scene if you want to take that into VR. That all takes place here. The little teapot is basically activating the render. That is your click and go. This little window opens up the actual rendering window, and it also provides a few tools for editing our render once it's finished. If a render takes something like 18-24 hours, which is not uncommon, you could lose your mind a little bit if you realize that the color's slightly off, or one of the lights is throwing out a different hue, and in this window we can basically correct that afterwards. So back to our materials panel, and you'll also notice we've got two arrows, right and left. If we open up the right hand panel, we get a preview of whatever texture we've selected, and this is the rendered preview as well. So this is actually how it's going to appear in the render. This is the photorealistic finished result. The left hand panel will open up our materials library, which is downloaded automatically with Vray. You have a create option if you do want to create your own texture completely from scratch, and we also have a materials panel with loads of pre-installed textures, and many of these have very unique qualities. So all the emissive textures, for example, will actually glow and emit light. So let's close down the right hand panel here and just move it over. Let's start applying some of these textures to my model. So the first thing I'm going to do is change the floor. So I'm going to add a wood panelled floor, and let's go for these wood planks here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to drag my selection into my materials panel, and that way I can get a little preview, change all the settings, and basically this is now recorded in my library, so I can then come back to this and apply it to whatever I want. How do I get this texture onto the floor? Simply click on the floor until it's highlighted blue. Right click on your texture as it's shown in the materials panel here, and click apply to selection. And there we go, there's our texture in the SketchUp model. If you want to change the size or the rotation or the perspective of any of these, then you do it within SketchUp itself. You just right click on the surface that the texture's been applied to, go to texture, position, you get these four little different coloured icons. If I click and drag on the green one, I can scale it and rotate that texture. Once I'm happy, I just click off there. Now, straight off the bat, I can render this and see what we've got. So it's just this little teapot icon in the asset editor. If I click on that, this new window appears and we have a rendered preview. Don't worry about the quality. We can change all that towards the end, and to be honest, leave the quality really low. This is 800 by 450 currently. Leave it low, because that means it's going to render quickly and you're going to be able to work much faster. Okay, I like how that texture looks, so let's close that down. And let's start applying all the other textures. So let's apply a metal texture to the table. Let's go for like a brushed copper texture. Brill, I like the look of that. And I'm going to click on my table, right click back on the texture in the asset editor and apply that to the selection. Now this is one of the few things which can kind of trip people up. See how the texture in SketchUp is all grey, whereas the texture in Vray is the bronze texture that we're looking for. Now, many of these textures are made up of different layers, and I'm not going to explain it too much. I'm going to explain that in another video about texture maps, megascans, those other textures that you can get. Basically, just for this purpose here, certain layers of this texture will override others in the preview in SketchUp. So don't be worried if this looks different to this. All you do is click on render and you can see that the text is absolutely fine. As I say, I'll explain more of this in another video. Now, that's not as reflective as I'd like it. I'd like it to be almost a mirror finish in the table surface here. And what I'm going to do is zoom in just so we get a bit of a clearer render there. Yeah, it's slightly blurry, and that's because I've applied a brushed texture. Now, how do I make that more reflective? And this is basically what we would do if we wanted to add any other new property to this texture. Another point you might trip yourself up on. See here in our material panel that we've got a reflection panel. A reflection tab, sorry. Now, if I try and change anything there, it's going to make almost no difference to the preview here. And that's because, to really simplify this, I am changing how reflective this texture already is. And if the texture isn't really that reflective, any changes I'm going to make aren't going to have much difference. It's really confusing, but when I actually go to add new layer up in the top right here and add a reflective coat, you can see that I've actually created this really visible, striking, reflective layer. So if you want to add a new property to a texture, then you've got to add a new layer. Don't change what you've already got in the materials panel. And this will change depending on what layers are in that texture. So now when I render this, you can see my reflection is much sharper and we get this glossy finish to the table. In fact, we can even see the little plant pot in the background there. So that's much better. I'm much happier with that. Okay, so let's start applying textures to the other parts of the model. So just to save time, I'm going to quickly apply some textures to the whole model overall. See how I dragged in a new copper brush texture? That's because my previous one has that reflective coat that I don't want on any other object. So if you've changed this copper texture here, for example, but you want that same texture without the changes you've made, just drag in a new one. Let's add a little bit of a cushion to the top of the stool here. So let's click on the top and go to fabric and add in this red fabric here. So dragging that over, right click, apply to selection. See here, beige, red, but it will appear in the render, don't worry. Let's add a colour for this back panel here. Let's see if we've got like a paint texture that we can add. Let's go for this blue. It says it's reflective, so let's add that. right click, apply to selection. So I applied the material to the whole object, and now I'm going to select specific objects to change. It's a much quicker way of working. You don't have to select each individual object. Let's actually add a copper polish texture to this. It would make sense for the top bits here. And let's add a glass texture. So let's just add a bit of a coloured texture so you can see it, because I've not got a background here, so the glass isn't really going to look that great for this top bit. Okay, let's change the glass as well on the table. Let's change it. There should be a crystal. Yes, there is. Drag that over. See how quick it is? You're just selecting the material, dragging it over, and then click apply. I don't think that has applied actually. Right click apply. Ah, yeah, there it has. Let's change the candlestick as well. What we're going to change with that? Let's go to. We just need a metal, don't we? Really? What have we got there? Champagne. Yeah, let's go for that. Let's apply a clay texture to the backdrop here. If you go onto the model making page on the technical resources tab on Moodle, you'll find in the things of interest tab that there's a long list of resources where you can get textures from. So if you want to get textures downloaded, just have a look at that. Ceramic, let's add some clay. Apply that to the selection. Let's make that slightly reflective as well. So add layer in the top right, reflective coat. You see there we get a nice kind of shine to it. Okay, so let's see. Oh, let's just add something to the rim here. There we go. And what should we change? Should we just change that to a? Let's just change that to a paint. Ooh, let's. Oh no, we can't do that. Let's add the same blue. Why not? Apply to selection. Okay. So there we go. Now you see I've not applied any textures to this bottle here. Vray will render anything you've got in there. It doesn't have to be a Vray texture. So if I click on render, you can see that label still coming through. So at this point I can see that my model's the wrong way round to face the SketchUp lighting. So I'm just going to quickly rotate that. Go back into Vray and render. There we go. You see that my lighting is actually filling up the page there. And I'm happy with those textures. Next step, let's add some lighting. And let's say this was indoors. I don't want any of the sky or the atmospheric lighting coming through. So I'm going to go to my lighting tab. And where it says sunlight, I'm going to open up the right-hand panel, click on sunlight. You see I get a preview of the lighting there, just the same as we do with our textures and materials. And we've got loads of settings for that. We can change the colour of the sky, the size of the sun, we can change fog, turbidity, all sorts of things. And quite simply, I'm just going to turn down the intensity, which is just how strong that lighting is. I'm going to turn it almost off. And now when I render, yeah, pretty much all the lighting's gone. And that's because I'm going to add my own in. To add in my own light, we're going to go back into SketchUp, go to Extensions, Vray, go down to Vray Lights, and we've got loads of options here, and each light has different properties. Just play around with those, see what you like. I'm going to click on Sphere, and to bring it into my model, I'm just going to click, drag, and then click. And this is an object like anything else in SketchUp, so I can select it, I can scale it, I can move it, I can rotate it. It's nothing different to any object we may bring in from the 3D warehouse, for example, or something that we've made ourselves. Okay, now let's see what happens when we render this. Almost nothing. We have the orb for where our light is, but it's not casting any light. And that's because it's simply too weak. Now, you'll see that in units we've got default and in brackets scalar. And if we click on the drop-down menu, you can see that we've actually got all different power units. So if you actually have a light bulb and you know the exact wattage for that bulb, you can actually type that in here so you can get very realistic and accurate lighting. I'm just going to keep it to default here, and I'm going to bump the intensity up to something like 10,000. Let's really overdo it. Click on render, and there we go. See the difference that makes? It's so much more realistic already. Oh, don't know what happened with the top there. I think I've applied 2 different textures. Weirdly, I kind of like it. Okay, now we can change anything at this point, so let's just make that lighting a little warmer. You see how it changes, even as we're dragging the colour here? Render that. Oh, it's much better, much better. Okay. Yeah, I'm pretty happy with that actually. I don't want to make too many changes. Now, say this was the image I wanted, but actually I wanted to get rid of the light, but keep the light it was emitting. That's fine. Just go to Options in the lighting panel and turn on Invisible. You see in the preview the actual light disappears, and when we now render, it's that same image, just the light itself has disappeared. Real, I'm pretty happy with that. Let's just zoom in and make sure everything looks okay from a close-up view. Yeah, that's not bad at all. I mean, you see, we've really spent no time at all doing this. Imagine what you could do if you spent just a couple of hours really refining everything. The glass in particular, that Vray texture is just coming through marvellously there. Right, let's get a close-up just to really see the difference that's making. Takes a little bit of time for it to come through, but there we go. Little grainy. You can see it's just starting to break it all down now. I'm going to show you a different way of previewing this, which people may find more satisfying. Okay, now what are we going to do with the export? So we've gone through materials, we've gone through lighting. Now let's go to our settings. First thing, we've got 2 options here, interactive and progressive. If we enable interactive rendering, basically every change we make to our model is going to start a new render. I would really advise against enabling this because it's just going to slow your system down massively. No matter what the spec is, it's going to have that effect. Now, progressive rendering is what you've just seen in that preview, where our whole image is really pixelated and it becomes more refined and detailed as time goes on. If we turn off progressive and render, same thing at the start, but once this slider goes to the end, all these little white squares just suddenly rush across our screen. And you can see that the area they've covered is 100% rendered. And this is the method I prefer because when you have progressive rendering turned on, it renders the whole image at the same quality at the same time. And if you're doing a really long render, this can sometimes trick you into thinking that the computer's frozen. And let's face it, for many of our detailed models, we're going to be expecting that anyway. So with this method, we can really see if our render is active and we can see its progression. It's overall just much more satisfying and gives you peace of mind. And you can see that even though I'm on a low quality render, it's still taking a wee bit of time there. Now, my interest here is the glass. So what would I do if I just wanted to see a preview of the glass. And I'm just going to change a few other settings first before I show you that. Obviously, quality is set to medium. We can set that up to high. The higher you set that, the better the quality, but the longer it's going to take to render. I will say that obviously we've got max settings here to create the most amazing renders, but there is a balancing act between how long it's going to take and what your system can handle and really the overall desired output. If we go to camera, we can click on standard and change that to spherical panorama if you want something you can look around in VR. If I go to render output, probably one of our most important settings is the image width and height. This is the overall quality of the image. Currently it's set to 800 by 450. If I wanted this image to be HD, I would then change that to 1920 by 1080. And obviously if you want in 4K images, 2K images, you're going to change this accordingly. If you're doing a render for a screen, pardon me, if you're doing a film or something for TV, then you can change your aspect ratio here. Here you've got save image. Now, if you want to save your render, we can do that at the end. But if you spent 18 hours rendering an image and you accidentally close the window without saving it, then you're going to go through the roof. So I would always recommend saving your image before you render it. And this is basically like a reservation kind of thing. So enable save image. Click on the little icon here to open up your directory. And basically, once you've got your file path here, click on render. Once the render's finished, it will automatically save your image. So there's no risk of you accidentally deleting it. A great little setting, particularly useful to see the effect of the lighting you're adding, is material override. Let's turn this on and start a new render. All of our textures disappear and we just see the plain model with our lighting. So we can really see the direct effect of the lights we've added. I think a great way of presenting digital models if you are rendering is to have an exported image of this model here in SketchUp, then do a material override render to show the rendered geometry, and then have your final render with all your textures and lighting and backdrops and what have you. You know, a 3-stage thing really showing off all aspects of your model. So we've got quality high, image width set to HD. You know, that's going to be a really nice render. So let's render that. Oh, I forgot to turn off material override. There we go. Okie dokie. One thing to point out, in the top left, you see it says 25% of 1920 by 1080. That's not saying it's rendering at a quarter of the quality. That's just zooming in and out. You can see that changes as we go along. And you can tell the quality of an image by setting it to 100% and seeing how much it fills your screen. Now this is going to take a while, and I honestly don't know how long it's going to take. So if I just want to see how this glass is going to look, up at the top here we've got all these little icons, and there's a teapot with a little red rectangle in the bottom right hand corner. It's called Region Renderer. If I click on that, I can drag a red box around that glass, and the next time I click on render, it will render just that selected area of the image, which is brilliant because we can see how a texture looks fully rendered without having to spend ages actually rendering the whole thing. Obviously this is still going to take a long time because I've set the settings up so high. So there we have it. We've got loads of other settings, as you can see here, important things like global illumination and denoiser, and we've got loads of other settings on our materials panel. But there really you have a kind of quick guide to rendering in Blender. Fantastic way of showing off your digital models. I'd really recommend it. But remember that we can render in many, many other programs. This is just one example. So please do check out other videos that I'll be putting up for comparisons between those rendering engines.